The house where walls whisper. The carriage came to a halt before a towering mansion, its silhouette barely visible through the creeping mist. The moonlight carved out the decayed grandeur of the estate, tilted columns, elaborate wooden shutters hanging ajar, and towering stained glass windows that glowed faintly with eerie reflections. "Are you certain, Miss Elliot?" the coachman asked, his voice hesitant as he glanced at the house with evident unease. Margaret Elliot nodded, adjusting the cuffs of her gloves. Her mourning attire clung to her slender frame, the black veil obscuring most of her face. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. She stepped onto the damp gravel, gripping the handle of her small suitcase. Before her loomed the massive oak doors, adorned with an aged brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. The letter had arrived just a week ago. A lawyer, one Mr. Aldrich, had summoned her to this house, claiming urgent matters regarding her late family. It had been years since she last heard of the estate. Ravenshade Manor, her ancestral home. A gust of wind rattled the iron gates behind her, and in that moment, she thought she heard something, a faint murmur from within the house. Taking a deep breath, she raised the knocker and struck it against the door. The sound echoed, deep and hollow, as if swallowed by the mansion itself. Then, silence. Margaret waited. Just as she considered knocking again, the door creaked open on its own. Darkness yawned beyond the threshold, the air within carrying the scent of damp wood and something else, something rotten. Steeling herself, she stepped inside. And the door slammed shut behind her. Margaret stood motionless, the echo of the slamming door fading into the oppressive silence. The air inside was thick with age, carrying the scent of damp wood, old paper, and something faintly sour, like decayed flowers left too long in a vase. A single candelabrum flickered at the end of the grand entrance hall, casting long, restless shadows across the marble floor. The light did little to chase away the darkness, which pooled thickly in the corners like ink spilled over ancient stone. She hesitated before moving forward. Though it had been years since she last set foot in Ravenshade Manor, the place felt oddly familiar, yet distorted, as if time had warped its very bones. Margaret reached into the folds of her dress, pulling out the letter that had summoned her. The words were penned in a sharp, precise hand. "Miss Elliot. There are matters concerning your family estate that require your immediate attention. You must come to Ravenshade Manor at once. Your presence is expected by midnight. Mr. Aldrich." She glanced at the ornate grandfather clock in the hallway. It had stopped at precisely 11:58. A prickle of unease crept up her spine. Somewhere deeper in the house, floorboards creaked. Margaret turned sharply, her heartbeat quickening. The sound had come from the main hall beyond the staircase. But she could see no movement, only the flickering candlelight shifting against the walls. Then, a voice. A whisper, low and urgent, curling through the darkness like a breath of wind through a crypt. "You should not have come back." Margaret froze. The words had not come from any direction she could pinpoint. They were simply, there. Hanging in the air. Her fingers clenched around the letter. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever secrets Ravenshade held, they were hers to uncover. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped forward. And the whispering began again. Margaret pressed forward, her footsteps light against the marble floor. The candlelight quivered as if disturbed by an unseen presence, casting restless shadows that seemed to stretch and recoil at her approach. She reached the base of the grand staircase. The wood was dark with age, its balustrade carved into the shapes of twisting vines. Her fingers hovered over the railing but hesitated to touch it, something about the way the carvings coiled made her stomach tighten. A soft tap, 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 echoed above her. Margaret's breath caught. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly light, as if someone were walking just beyond sight. She raised her gaze to the second-floor landing, where the darkness pooled thickest. The candlelight below didn't reach that far. The steps had stopped. She was not alone. Swallowing hard, she forced herself up the stairs. The wood creaked beneath her, each step swallowed by the thick silence of the house. At the top, a long corridor stretched before her, lined with doors, some ajar, others firmly shut. The wallpaper, once rich with floral patterns, had faded to a sickly yellow, peeling in long strips that curled like grasping fingers. And then she saw them. Footprints. A trail of bare, dusty prints led from one of the open doors at the far end of the hall. They were small, almost childlike, but wrong. The toes were too long. The arch too narrow. A chill spread through her limbs. The prints did not start at the doorway. They simply began in the middle of the corridor, as if something had stepped out of thin air. A whisper brushed against her ear. "You must not wake it." Margaret spun, her pulse hammering. No one was there. Only the decayed walls and the darkened stairwell behind her. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket, clutching the letter like an anchor. She had come for answers. But something in this house did not want her to find them. She exhaled slowly. Then, gathering her resolve, she followed the footprints into the darkened room. And the door closed behind her. The door slammed shut with a force that sent dust swirling into the air. Margaret whirled around, grasping for the handle, only to find nothing. The wood was smooth beneath her fingertips, with no sign of a knob or keyhole. As if the door had never meant to be opened again. A deep, suffocating silence filled the room. She turned slowly, her heartbeat a violent drumbeat in her ears. It was a bedroom. Or at least, what was left of one. The air was thick with decay, the wallpaper blackened with moisture. A massive four-poster bed loomed in the center, its once fine canopy draped in tattered, yellowing curtains. The fabric shifted ever so slightly, as if something had just disturbed it. Margaret took a cautious step forward. The wooden floor bowed under her weight, creaking like an exhalation. And then, a shape stirred behind the curtains. She stopped breathing. It was slight at first, a faint shudder of fabric, as though something had shifted in its sleep. Then, a slow, deliberate pressing outward, the unmistakable outline of a hand. The air in the room turned frigid. The hand curled against the fabric. The fingers were too long. The joints bent wrong. And it was rising, slowly, unnaturally, as though something was standing up from the bed. Margaret took a step back, her heel catching on the warped floorboards. The curtains parted. And she saw it. A figure. Or rather, the lack of one. It was a hollow space in the shape of a person. A perfect absence where a body should have been. The sheets beneath it were untouched, unslept in. And yet, the thing moved. It turned toward her. Margaret's breath came in short, panicked gasps. Her limbs locked in place as the figure took a slow step forward. Then another. The wood did not creak beneath its feet. Her own weight shifted, and suddenly, the bed collapsed. Margaret fell backward, hitting the ground hard as the canopy above caved inward. For a split second, dust and darkness swallowed everything. And something cold touched her wrist. She screamed. Kicking, scrambling, she tore herself free, crawling toward the door that wasn't there. The whispering began again, this time all around her, rising in frantic, overlapping voices. "You woke it. You woke it. You woke it." A sound, a breath that wasn't hers, stirred the back of her neck. Margaret lunged forward, her hand striking the wall. And suddenly, the door was there. She wrenched it open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind her. The whispers stopped. The corridor was silent. But Margaret did not need to look back to know. The door had no knob on this side either. Whatever was inside that room was still there. And now, it was awake. Margaret stumbled away from the door, her breath ragged. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but the hallway was silent. Too silent. The air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The candlelight below barely reached the second floor now, swallowed by the gloom pressing in from all sides. And then, the door behind her shuddered. A slow, deliberate movement. Margaret froze. The wood bulged outward, as though something on the other side were pressing against it. Tap. A single knock. Soft. Almost playful. Then, scratch. A sound like nails dragging down the length of the door. Margaret took a step back. The door rippled. The wood stretched and convulsed, as though the thing inside were pressing against it from all angles at once. The whispers returned, rising from beneath the floorboards, from the walls, from the very air itself. "It's coming." Margaret turned to run. But the corridor wasn't right anymore. The walls had lengthened. The doors lining the hall had multiplied. The way back to the staircase seemed farther away than before. She started forward. Thud. The door burst open. And something spilled out. Not a person. Not an animal. A shape, broken and wrong. It crawled. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways that defied nature. A gaping hollow space sat where its face should have been, a perfect absence of light. And yet, it turned toward her. Margaret ran. The hallway stretched before her, endless now, twisting in impossible directions. The walls seemed to pulse, the wallpaper shivering as if something beneath it was breathing. Behind her, the thing scuttled forward, fast, too fast. The whispering voices turned to screeches. Margaret threw herself down the staircase, her hands scraping against the banister. She landed hard, pain jolting up her side, but there was no time. She scrambled to her feet, gasping. The front door. It stood before her, open. Had it been open before? She didn't care. She ran toward it. And as she crossed the threshold, the house screamed. A deafening, shattering wail that tore through her bones, a sound of rage, of hunger. And of something that was not yet finished with her. The world lurched. The ground vanished. And Margaret fell into blackness. Margaret awoke with a violent start, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was no longer on the staircase, no longer falling through darkness. She was alone. But the silence was unbearable. It pressed against her ears, suffocating her thoughts, closing in like an invisible weight. She blinked, trying to focus, and realized. She wasn't in Ravenshade Manor anymore. The room she found herself in was small and unremarkable, walls bare except for peeling wallpaper and an ancient bed covered in tattered sheets. There was no window, no source of light except for a dim, flickering lantern that sat on a small table. Her heart began to race. Where was she? She pushed herself off the bed and stumbled to the door. She threw it open. And froze. On the other side, the hallway stretched on forever. The same endless corridor from Ravenshade Manor, the same warped walls and flickering candlelight. The thing was gone. But the air was thick with its presence. The whispers had not stopped. They were closer. She spun around, and in the dim light, she saw, on the far wall, a mirror. A mirror that shouldn't have been there. Margaret approached it, her hands trembling as she reached for the cool surface. She didn't recognize the reflection at first. Her face was pale, haunted by the night's horrors, but it was her. Her. And then, a shadow shifted behind her in the glass. She whirled around. Nothing. But the mirror showed something else. In its depths, the hallway behind her stretched impossibly far, the walls crumbling as though they were being consumed by something from beyond. And in the distance, a figure. It was crawling. The same, twisted thing from before. But now it was in the mirror, in her world. Her chest tightened as she stepped back, eyes locked on the reflection. The thing's hollow face twisted toward her, its body jerking unnaturally as it dragged itself closer. The whispers grew louder. Frenzied. And in the reflection, the thing smiled. It opened its mouth. And the world shattered. Epilogue. The house of Ravenshade stood in the distance, untouched by time, its windows dark and silent. The winds blew cold through the trees, carrying the faintest of whispers, the softest of cries. But in the mansion, all was still. And the thing, which had once been a hollow shape, now waited. It always waits.